There we go. So if you don't want to be, if you don't want to be just to be part of the recording, you can drop off. Otherwise, continue on. Welcome to the VCF on VxRail session update and best practice. This is the first in 3 sessions we'll be running, the core Q2, Q3, and Q4. Talking to Faisal and David. This will be a foundation session. And let me see if I could. Okay, this will be a foundation session that we're setting today, although I think we'll get into quite a bit of detail. For those of you that want to ask questions, we encourage you, please ask questions, but please ask questions through the chat. And as you questions come up, we'll try to answer we meaning Faisal and David, will try to answer questions as we go through the session. We think that's probably the most efficient way of trying to answer all your questions that you're asking. If we don't get to every question, what we'll do is we'll answer them and then post them back for the entire team later. Okay. One quick thing I want to mention is that this is a VCF on VxRail update and best practice. This is not a substitute for the VCF on VxRail 11-hour training. So if you haven't done that yet, consider taking the training and also the assessment test associated with this on that. On this call today, we have a number of people from partners that meet all the requirements for VCF on VxRail. The only thing that they're missing really is the assessment test for the VCF on VxRail portion, the online training. They have all the master's competencies from that required for VMware. So those people that come from companies that meet all the requirements. My team will follow up with you after this call over the next few days to encourage you to take the assessment test and get the full competency for deployment for VCF on VxRail. There are many other partners on the phone have one or more of the VMware master's competencies. We'll also follow up with you to see if we can guide you through the rest of the deployment process for VCF on VxRail. VCF on VxRail is going to be, I was just reading an email the other day from one of our colleagues. It's really going to be the cornerstone for our hybrid Apex hybrid cloud. So it's going to be more and more important for us as we get through the year and next year. So please consider finishing the training and finishing these all the requirements and getting the full certification. I don't want to take too much of your time today. I think that we have a lot to cover, so I'll turn this over to Faisal and David, who will be leading you through the conversation today. All right, and I'll stop sharing for you. There we go. Okay, Faisal, now David, take it over.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Just going to share my screen. Just give me a second. Okay, hopefully you can all see that.
Yes, I can see it. Yes.
Okay, yeah. Right. So yeah, thank you, and morning, everyone. So lovely to meet everyone. Well, see everyone here. So just a very quick introduction, and we'll get straight into it. My name's Faisal Chowdhury. I'm part of the Global Engineering Outreach Specialists, and we can talk more about the role towards the end. Where we work with engineering, we also work with the field, we work with partners, and we do get involved on site as well. That's enough about it. And I live in London. David?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you. It's great attendance here this morning. Faisal and I are part of the same team, as Faisal mentioned. It's the GEOS team, and I'm based out of Cork in Ireland.
So myself, David, and Stephen, we had quite a few chats about what to cover on this very first session, and went through a few ideas. Let me go show you the agenda, just what we're planning and what we wanted to really do today, because this is the very first session, and we know there's a very mixed level of knowledge. We wanted to really set up a foundation and just get everyone to the same level. And that's really our purpose today. And we thought what we could then do is when we have the following sessions from this, we can then start to focus on particular topics, and give you, more updates and so on. And also, really good to hear from you as well after the session, what types of topics you guys would like to go through on follow-up sessions as well. So that's really the purpose of today. And what we set up for today is we want to go through an overview. We all know from understanding, you've all got very good knowledge of VxRail. VCF is probably where there's varying levels of knowledge and experience. I think some of you might not have seen it, some of you may have, and the purpose really is to set the foundation there. So we'll go through an overview of what you're adding there with VCF. We'll go through the architecture, and then I want to talk also about lifecycle management, and we'll see how we're doing for time on skip level upgrades, or we could even do a separate session on that. What David and I also want to do is, because we understand your partners and you're involved in all the same work as we are, so we want to sort of approach this as from that aspect. And so we also want to show you the resources we use, including labs and demos. And so we'll try and mix all that in. And I have a lot of slides in this deck, but I'm not going to go through all of them. We really put this together for you because we'll share the slides with you and it's for your own knowledge. So I've picked some certain slides we're going to go through in here. And then, like I said, we can focus more on specific topics in other sessions as well. So that's the plan. Okay, everyone's okay with that. Questions, we've got a chat. There's a lot of you on here, so that's the best way to add your questions. If we can't get through every single question today, then David and I will have a look at these afterwards as well. And we'll send an email or something out to you anyway, where we've got answers to those questions as well. All right, so apart from that, then let's get started. And don't want you to get worried, I'm not going to go through any marketing hype, but what I wanted to really show or say here is what we're going to focus on within this session is really the infrastructure we're building here, which then enables us to build the platforms and the application services that sit on top. Now that's really the function over here. And what does VCF then add on top of VxRail, particularly the lifecycle management and the automation, and what benefits that gives us and how that works. And there are also some best practices and some rules that we do follow when we're building VCF on top of VxRail. So we're going to go through some architectural rules and do's and do nots as well. One key point about how this is all built is that it's standardized, repeatable infrastructure, and it's based on VxRail. And by standardized, the SDDC really adds automation on top of VxRail, and those automation, those rules, all follow the principles of VMware's validated designs. So these are all tested, validated solutions, but then automated. So if you haven't seen VCF before, and we'll also go do a walkthrough of the UI and the tools, most of your day-to-day work would still happen through vCenter on the infrastructure level. But the automations, you'd basically run through the SDDC manager, and those would be things like deploying workload domains, and we'll go through what a workload domain is, for example, and also lifecycle management. And also you can kick off other deployments and automations as well relating to NSX, Kubernetes, for example, and so on. Lifecycle management is really, for me, I think it's one of the most important key aspects of this product. And that's really where even a lot of successful engineering teams who will build by hand because they're so successful, that's something that they will struggle with because there's so much to do and it's never ending, and it's constantly matching and checking and testing. And what teams want to do is really do more interesting things rather than just updating hardware and all the patches and upgrades. And so lifecycle management achieves to automate that entire process. And then with VxRail on there as well, we're still working through the SDDC manager, but we run that entire lifecycle management right down to hardware, so BIOS updates, firmware, and so on. And so we'll talk more about that and how that works later on towards the end of the presentation. So, good place to start. We thought, because you're partners, we thought we'd go through the architecture and then really show you, what we do from day 0 to day 2. So we could show you a very quick build of also, how do you implement VCF on top of VxRail. What I thought I'd start with is just a diagram. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a second. Right, let me share it again. Right. So what I'm going to try and do is just draw whiteboard architecturally what we have here. So a key point is, we're starting off with the VxRail cluster here. So we use VxRail Manager to bring up that cluster. I know you all know VxRail very well, and just very quickly. So what we would start off or have, so let's say we have 4 nodes here, and I'm going to draw basically create the distributors, the DVS here, and then start building the networks we'd have to start off with. So basically starting off with we'd have our internal management to start off with. So that would be, for example, so that'll be our VLAN 3939. And then we'd also have our external management. Let me just zoom in a little bit there. So let's pick a different color here. And then we'd have external management. So we've run the VxRail manager. We've gone through a deployment. And actually, we could draw a line here because we're going to be adding more onto here as well. So if I draw a line up here, and then I can add on here. So we'd have a VxRail manager running here. We'll have a vCenter, embedded PSC as well. So on a VCF VxRail deployment, this is all completely greenfield. We'd have to start with a brand new VxRail deployment, and then we'd add VCF on top. But we'd use the automation of VxRail to build our VxRail cluster first. So we'd already also, before we start the VCF build, have our vSAN port group. vSAN, and also we'd have, let's do that, vMotion. All right, so that should all be familiar to everyone. It's our distributed switch. And we'll also have a production network. So let's do, let me just stick a line inside here. And I'll call that as production. Okay, we'll have at least one. And we can add more later on as well. Right, so we'll have, let's do one of these nodes here. So we'll have that. That's our distributed switch configured, and that's our VxRail cluster built. So now I want to add VCF on top. So the first thing we do is we'll add an OVA. This is called the Cloud Builder. And this is what we use on day 0 to build VCF on top of VxRail. And so we'll have a parameter sheet, and in that sheet we'll specify all the, similar to VxRail, we'll specify all the rules of all the bits we want, the VLANs and IP addresses and FQDNs and hosts and so on. And then we'll run Cloud Builder. That then builds the SDDC manager. And we'll give you a walkthrough of that. And this is all still on our, this is on our management network. Now, when you're going through the deployment, the key component, key part then that VCF is adding onto our VxRail cluster are the NSX related components. So I'm going to start drawing those in. Let me also, over here, just add, so this will also be our SSO domain. That vCenter that was built by VxRail, we'll make a few changes to that during the VCF deployments, because originally that vCenter was deployed as an internal vCenter by the VxRail build, and we'll externalize that vCenter. And the reason we do that is because we want SDDC to really take charge, VCF to really take charge of that vCenter. And then subsequently, when we add more workloads using enhanced link mode, then other vCenters will be added to that. And that's also important for lifecycle management. So we'll have our SSO domain. This is our VCF instance now. We've externalized the vCenter. And so this cloud builder is adding components, particularly the NSX parts I mentioned. So with NSX then, we're going to have within and let's call this our management cluster, this external management network here. We'll have our NSX manager cluster built. Now this is, I'm basing this diagram on VCF 4. The current version we're running at the moment is 4.2. So this will all be NSXT based. Previously, so even in 3.x, when NSXT first was released, then, well, when VCF was initially released, it was based on, we were running NSXV. And then later on, we still had NSXV within the management cluster, but we could add NSXT or V into a workload domain. So here, the only option is NSXT. And the other big difference in the 4X family is that, unlike 3X, where we had NSXV and we had NSXT and we'd have a distributed switch, we then have an additional NVDS that was built for NSXT, and we'd need to have separate free NICs in order to use that. So that's not the case here anymore. So this is all part of the same distributed switch. So the NSXT components are built. So we'll also have port groups for our NSX taps. So these are the IPs for our tunneling endpoints for the Geneva network. And then you've got an option, which is also part of the bring up of deploying something called AVN, which are our application virtual network, which is based on VVD design. If you want to, for example, deploy the vRealize suite, then this is a mandatory requirement of architecturally how the vRealize suite is deployed in terms of the overlays, in terms of the networks. So the AVN network basically designs logical segments, and into that design, the concept of that design is basically is designed for disaster recovery type scenarios. So you'll have a logical segment, and you'll have an X region as well, and the components from your vRealize suite will be deployed onto that. Now, for that AVN deployment, we'll need a number of things. So what will happen as part of that deployment, just got some objects here I used, we'll have some we'll have an NSX edge cluster built. Part of the requirements we'll need to feed in to our deployments will include, we'll need an uplink, 2 uplinks for the edges. We'll have our AVN enabled, and we'll also have we'll have edge taps, which we'll need as well for that build. We'll also use dynamic routing here. So we'll also set up BGP as part of this configuration. So we'll have then, I draw here, these will be our BGP ASNs. So we'll have that. So these are our edge clusters, and we'll have 2 of those deployed. And then we'll have our logical segments also built. So there'll be, let's put that over here and call that that's our region specific logical segment. And then we'll also have, let's change the color on this one, just the orange. And that'll be our cross region. I'll call that X region, logical segment. And so our vRealize suite components are then built across those logical segments, which then enables that VDV design. And again, as I mentioned, that's also part of, for a disaster recovery type setup as well. It enables failure. And so if I draw the vRealize components, so when you've built VCF as part of day 0, then you would also, within the parameters sheet, specify whether you want, let's just put into here, we call this is part of our AVN deployment, whether you want that or not. And if you are deploying vRealize later on, then that is a requirement. So as soon as you say yes to the AVN section, then you specify all the parameters you need to then create this environment here, to deploy the edges, to create the region logical segments. Then on day 2, what you would do is you would deploy the vRealize Lifecycle Manager through SDDC Manager, which would actually sit within the X region. So I've called that VRSLCM. And then you would use that to then deploy the other components, which are part of that vRealize suite. So for example, that would include components such as Workspace ONE. And then from inside that, then you would then start deploying all the vRealize components like, so let me just type in here, vRealize suite. But that would include things like, and these will be separate installations, Operations Manager. Oops, excuse my spelling there. vRealize Automation. So here now you can start creating your blueprints and your automations. vRealize Automation, and so on. So that is all part of the AVN setup, which includes the edge cluster deployment, and then day two, then you deploy your vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager, and you start deploying the components onto the logical segments that were created by that AVN build during the day zero bring up. I also forgot to mention there's also, so as part of the NSX deployment, then you're deploying bibs on the hosts, and each host then has a host VDS, which is part of the NSX structure, which is added here. And so every single host then connects to a transport zone, which is part of the NSX construct. Okay. So I think that's a good place to stop with our diagram there. So let me just check any questions so far, but hopefully that's giving you an idea architecturally of what we're building. So let's just pause for a second there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Hey, David, can you see any questions as yet or anything?
Yeah, we have it under control, Hazel. Yeah, all good.
Great. Okay, perfect. All right. Yeah. All right, so hopefully everyone's okay with that so far. Let me just stop sharing for a second. And that'll hopefully have thrown some more concepts to you there. All right, let's go back to the slides. So share my screen again. Okay, there we go. Right, so that's giving you an idea of architecture, and I definitely, I threw some terms in there, which we're going to see later on as we go through some of the slides, which hopefully that'll help understand some of the concepts. So what thought we'd do also here is just based on that diagram, and you saw how we start off with a VxRail cluster, and we use VxRail Manager to build that, and then on top of that, then we deploy VCF. We thought, well, let's show you that. I've already mentioned day two type activities. So for example, how you would automate the vRealize Lifecycle Management deployment, and then the vRealize suite. I mean, that could also include creating a Kubernetes cluster. So Tanzu deployments, once you've got that foundation all set up on day two. We do have a support matrix. So you can't just add any VCF version to any VxRail version. And that's important because we jointly engineer this platform with VMware and test then. And then we have a support matrix then which tells us which versions of VxRail are supported on which version of VCF. And then we also do use Solve. So as part of being a partner, and also, we also then use internally, we use Solve procedures, and we have very prescriptive documents that go through step by step how to build that environment. So David, if you could just show them just quickly, just Solve, and once they do start working with VCF, just some of how Solve looks on the VCF side, and then I can show them then just a very quick build of VCF. Just stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, no problem. Just bear with me for 1 second. I'll bring up. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Faisal, you see my screen?
I can see it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, perfect. So basically, guys, when you are certified for VCF on VxRail, you will be presented with the option for VMware Cloud Foundation for VxRail procedures. So you delve in here and you click on the deployment procedure. This will give you a full listing of all the supported versions of VCF on VxRail and the combination. So you can see, for example, our latest combination here is VCF 421 with VxRail 70131. So selecting that guy, then we have the option of VCF on VxRail initial bring up, or just a VI workload domain deployment. So that may be the case where you already have VCF deployed and you're adding on a VI workload domain. So just as an example, we'll choose the first one, which is the initial bring up of VCF. Click next. If you're doing a stretched cluster, it'll give you all the guidance around stretched cluster. And if you're deploying with a second DVS for NSXT, which is a new feature, you can also choose that option here. Click yes, for example. And then you have the various architectures. So Faisal is going to cover these off in a few minutes, but you have standard, consolidated, management domain and workload domain. So you may
I'm here for a second. Hang on.
Doesn't matter. I have to go.
Sorry, now. What are you saying to me?
I just.
Sorry, guys. Yeah. So these are the various architectures. You've got a management domain. You have a standard architecture, consolidated architecture. And if you're deploying a management domain with a workload domain, which in most cases we would be, at least we'd be going with the 4-node management domain and possibly a 3 or 4-node workload domain as a minimum. So selecting that guy, clicking next, then it gives you the NSXT manager options. So you can create a new NSXT instance for WD or join an existing NSXT instance. So again, these are new features with 421. We won't get into the detail on these today. But I think we have plans for follow-up sessions to cover these types of options in more detail. Next, and that's a very basic overview, guys. That gives you an example. It'll generate a lengthy procedure that you can then follow to execute the bring up and deployment of VCF and VxRail. Back to you, Faisal.
Okay, thanks, Ed. All right, so what I'll show you here then is a deployment. I'm actually going to use right, so hopefully you can all see that, David. So I've got the interactive demo VMware Cloud Foundation on Dell EMC VxRail. So if you guys can all see that. So this is our demo center. I thought I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone here, because we wanted to also show you some of the resources you can access and use, once the session is over. So I put in there VMware Cloud Foundation once I'd logged in. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, even Kubernetes as well, and a bunch of labs inside there as well. On the VCF VxRail side, so we've got a deployment workload domain management, so creating a workload domain. You've got a tour of the UI on 3x and on 4x. Deploying an NSXT edge cluster. I mentioned earlier on the AVN deployments, and part of that automation during day 0 is creating an edge cluster. You can create edge clusters in other workload domains as well. VCF with Tanzu management. So what we'll do here is I'm going to go through a Cloud Foundation deployment on VxRail, and that'll be a VCF 4 deployment. So just really showing you what I drew earlier on. Right, so we had our VxRail cluster built earlier, and then so I'm going to log in. And so we have 4 nodes here. Have our vCenter, we've got our VxRail manager. And I'm going to deploy an OVF template here. And that's the Cloud Builder. So VMware Cloud Builder I'd mentioned earlier on. So if I click on that, I'm going to open that. And that's deployed into our VxRail data center. Okay, 17 gig. And we're going to put that onto our vSAN data store. There you go. So storage policy. And this is the network, the port group we're going to select. So our management port group. And this is the IP address, FQDN, user IDs and passwords for the Cloud Builder. DNS servers. So there are some prerequisites, similar to again to VxRail. There are some prerequisites of things we need in place before we start doing this. So DNS needs to be up. We need FQD, we need the FQDN records already set up beforehand as well, NTP. And that's done. Right, so now Cloud Builder is being deployed. And then we have the parameter sheets I mentioned earlier on. And so, you worked with the customer and you got all the information about exactly what they want in terms of FQDNs, IP addresses, and so on. All those bits go into here, and that also includes whether you will have the AVN deployments or not on day 0. And then you need to put in all the information relating to NSX and the edge cluster deployment as well. So let's power that up. And now I'm going to log into the Cloud Builder. Agreements. And so that's quite important because VMware VCF, you can build on vSAN ready nodes, or you can build on VxRail as well. You can't mix and match. So if I have a VxRail environment, it has to be only VxRail, but just as a point here, there is a specific setting if you're building VCF on vSAN ready nodes from us or any other vendor, or if you're building this on VxRail. And that's certainly important in terms of how that determines how lifecycle management then works later on. So I'm going to select VMware Cloud Foundation on Dell EMC VxRail. Right. And then these are the prerequisites. It then tells us of things we need in place before we kick this off. So we need to have gone through our VxRail first run, and there should be a vCenter there and a VxRail manager there, and those VMs should be deployed. And I mean, David showed you the solve procedure earlier on. So that would go through a couple of other steps you would need to perform before you kick off the Cloud Builder part. ESXi versions match, hardware, prerequisites, top of rack switches. So again, you need to have certain VLANs all prepared and set up beforehand, and there's certain settings also in terms of the network, like jumbo frames recommended on all VLANs, particularly, and then you're going to need that for the NSX side. DHCP with an appropriate scope size. So for those TEP addresses, that's all assigned via DHCP. So you will need scopes set up for that on NSX. And if you're going to deploy AVN, then prepare your top of rack source switches by configuring BGP on them, defining the autonomous system AS number and router ID, and creating interfaces to connect with the NSX edge nodes, which is optional, but that's something you would select within your parameter sheet, and that would be a day 0 activity. Okay, so let's move on. And so here we're going to put in that parameter sheet with all the things we want this to build. So that's our workbook. So here it is for that particular customer. That's been uploaded. Okay, so that's just gone through a validation. It's made sure the constructs of that file is okay, nothing missing. So we've got host and IP DNS record validations, license key validations, time synchronization, ESX versions all matched, and so on. So that's all validated. And then we'll go into the deployment. And that takes about 2.5, 3 hours to deploy all of that. I think about 2 hours, yeah. And so that's now, so we'll look at this in stages of what's actually happening here. So a number of services being enabled, and then port group configurations here, license additions, and then really the majority of the setup here is the NSXT portion of the setup. So we're deploying NSXT managers, setting bit for NSXT managers, applying the licenses, generating NSXT data center transport nodes, and so on. Okay, there's a transport node, and parts we mentioned earlier on. So let's finish that off. Configuring SDDC manager for VxRail. And now we have the deploy and configure NSXT data center edge cluster and application virtual network. So assume for this parameter sheet, we had, yes, we do want the AVN setup because we're going to deploy vRealize as well later on. So we can see all the parts then being created here. And BGP and those ASN numbers set up, that was all a prerequisite to before actually running this. So the edge nodes being deployed here. And we'll have 2 edge nodes deployed within this AVN configuration. And then you can see T0 and Tier 1 being created, and then those logical segments will also be built. So the region specific and the X region segments will be deployed. Okay, and that is done. So now we'll launch SDDC Manager. I'm going to let David actually give you a walkthrough of the UI later on. But that's just very quickly, that's basically what the UI looks through. David actually set up built a rack, which is a live system. So that'll be actually very interesting as well. So I won't go through all these screens. But that is the deployment, so how we would deploy VCF on top of VxRail. Right, let me just take a quick check if we've got any questions there. All okay so far, David? Let me just stop sharing that.
Yep, all good.
Okay. So that was the demo center, part of our customer solution center. So we've got a link in our slides to that. And that was an example of what you can run through as well. If you haven't got a live environment you can play around on. Just going to get to the right slide, and then I'll show my screen again. Okay. So what I wanted to show you is when we were going through, and you should see a VCF and VxRail-NSXT slide now. It's showing you the deployment steps via Cloud Builder, but I wanted to give you an idea of what's happening in the background. You know, how much is being created through the VCF automation for the NSX portion of that build, and then on the right-hand side, you've got the additional steps if you had decided you want to deploy AVN as well, which includes then deploying those two edges, which then builds your edge cluster. There's also verification of BGP peering with Tor. So that's a manual prerequisite. That's something that you do before you deploy the AVN setup. Let's go to the next slide. And this is what's happening then when you deploy a workload domain. Again, there are NSX related steps when you're deploying that workload domain as well. So I mentioned that workload domain, and if you don't know what a workload domain is, it's purpose-built SDDC environment. So you will have another VxRail cluster. Now, if I was, going back to my earlier diagram, that was my greenfield installation, and I started off with a VxRail cluster that was fully built with its own vCenter. And then I externalized that vCenter, and I then ran Cloud Builder and deployed VCF on top of VxRail. And so that became our SSO domain, and that's our VCF instance. When I deploy a workload domain, what I then do is through the SDDC UI, there's a button which basically says, create a workload domain, and that then creates a vCenter. So it's now SDDC Manager that deploys the vCenter, and that vCenter then is connected to the original one through enhanced link mode, and we can do a maximum of 15 workload domains. That's because of the maximums, vCenters that we can create. So we can create 15 workload domains, including the management domain. So that SDDC, I click on a button that sets off an automation, a workflow that builds the workload that sets up that vCenter. And what I then do is I go and build my VxRail cluster. So I've got a new cluster, for example, of 4 nodes. I need 3 nodes. I build my VxRail cluster, and then I attach it to that external vCenter that SDDC just built. So that's how, I suppose, the process of building a workload happens once you've initially built the foundation and got VCF VxRail up and running. You've got an automated build on VxRail, and you attach it to that deployed vCenter in your VCF environment. And then you've got and then once that's all connected up, then all the operations are run through the SDDC Manager. So if you were adding additional nodes or so on, if you're expanding that workload domain, patching, lifecycle management is all done through the SDDC Manager. So this is our management domain that was created during the initial deployment. 1 per VCF instance, minimum 4 VxRail hosts. So that 4 is really down to vSAN and best practice rules based on a failure to tolerate the vSAN storage policy. So you could do 3 nodes, but 4 nodes means you have and this is vSAN, but this is VMware best practice. 4 nodes means you have an additional node spare if something went wrong. because you're basically mirroring objects, and you have 2 copies plus a witness. That's 3 objects, and then the 4th is a spare. And we can go into that in more detail in other sessions if you guys want to do things. Let's go through stuff like that. So we've got 4 nodes as a minimum here on our management cluster. We need vSAN storage, and then that management cluster runs the SDDC manager, vCenter server, NSX manager, NSX Edge. Optionally, we had a look at, we could also have then the vRealize suite. So vRealize suite Lifecycle Manager, vRealize suite Workspace One Access, and then you saw in that diagram, how the AVN setup and logical segments were deployed and where those objects actually sat, and that's all based on VVD design. Okay, so David, if I can hand over to you, and if you could do just a walkthrough on your live system, that would be great. Let me just stop sharing here.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, I'm not sure. Are you seeing the screen, Hazel?
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, I've got the SDDC Manager dashboard.
Okay, very good, perfect. Okay, guys, so this is basically a 4.2 installation of VCF on VxRail. I've logged into SDDC Manager using the SSO creds, administrator vSphere.local, and the first screen I'm presented with here is the dashboard screen. So this gives us a high-level overview of solutions. So if Kubernetes had been installed as a workload domain, it would present itself here. But the 2 basic workload domains in most deployments would be the management domain, which Faisal has covered just now, and a single VI workload domain. So that's kind of, at the minimum, that's a standard architecture VCF on VxRail deployment. It gives you the host count, whether they're hybrid or all flash. It gives you the resources, so the overall resource figures such as CPU, memory, storage, etc. So that's very basic stuff, but it's a nice high-level picture of what's consumed within your environment. And then it also gives you the recent tasks. So you can see here, going back to earlier in the month, I downloaded NSXT Manager 3.1, which was leveraged for the creation of the VI workload domain, and complete the task of adding the VxRail cluster to that VI workload domain, and then followed up with an edge cluster deployment specifically for the VI workload domain. So at a high level, that's the dashboard. At the top right, you'll see add workload domain. So if you wish to add additional workload domains, that's, as Faisal mentioned, that's 14 plus 1 workload domains that you can create. They're based on vCenter limitations, ELM limitations. So if I click on that guy, just to give you an example, it gives me the option for the VI domain creation setup. So clicking on him, just putting in some dummy values. You got your VI workload domain, your data center name, clicking next. You populate with your vCenter details. So essentially, what occurs at the beginning of the creation of a VI workload domain is the deployment of a vCenter. Put in your vCenter details here. It does a review, it does a validation, so it goes off and checks that those IP addresses and host names aren't in use, etc. And the host name resolves correctly. So that's the initial deployment of a VI workload domain using this workload domain button up here in top right. So if we dive into the actual workload domains themselves, so if I click in here to the management workload domain, it gives me a whole host of information, beginning with the NSXT details, NSXT manager details, vSAN details, and clicking through the tabs, You've got your services, so the vCenter associated with the workload domain, your NSXT cluster, and it gives you the pop-out links, so you can click on either of those, and it'll bring up the vCenter console or the NSXT Manager console. The next one shows the integration with VxRail. So in terms of updates and patches, you can do a pre-check in advance of an update. It'll give you details of scheduled or in progress updates, and will also present you with the option to apply updates. So if we click here on Cloud Foundation 4.2.1, which is the go-to version for this particular build, it'll present the 2 available updates to me and for my environment today. And it'll be done in a sequence manner, so it'll present the updates in the correct sequence they're meant to be deployed. Scrolling down further, we can see all the current versions deployed on this workload domain. So it gives you the SDDC Manager build, vCenter build. It gives you the VxRail, so it's 70131 in this case. And we can expand out each of these here to see our hosts. So it gives you ESXi 01, the exact ESXi version deployed, and the NSX details on the right. So you get your edge cluster and your host cluster. Scrolling back up to the top, we've got update history. Obviously, this is empty today, as I have not undertaken any upgrades as of yet. It gives you more details in terms of the hosts, their IP addresses, etc., associated cluster. And again, it gives you the pop-out links for each host if you want to dive into the specific host itself. Clusters, simple vSphere management cluster, and a security in terms of certificates associated with each component. If we go back over to the far left, just running through the tabs, it gives you an overall picture of all the hosts deployed in your environment, the host state. So there may be some hosts built out waiting for addition or expansion of a specific cluster, and that will present itself here as being available. And then you've got the associated cluster, resource usage, etc. Going further down into lifecycle management. So this is the bundle management. This will present all available bundles. So it'll give you all the associated VMware bundles. So that's 4.2.1, which is the next hop for this environment. And again, available today, and then it'll give you the future. So that's the sequencing. And these are install only bundles for NSXT and vCenter. Moving into the vRealize components. So it'll give you all the options for the various vRealize components, automation, VROPS, LI, log insight, and of course, VRSL-CM, which would be the first component to be deployed in advance of deploying the other vRealize components. Going further down, under administration, got all your licensing details, your user details. So depending on what kind of access you want to present to different admins within your organization, you can create users and groups associated with that. Repository settings. So in order to be able to pull down the bundles, either from VMware for all the VMware components, or from Dell for the VxRail bundle, you'll need to populate your credentials, your creds for each one of these. vRealize, so I do not have the VRSL-CM deployed as of yet, but these are the prerequisites associated with deploying VRSL-CM. And then to deploy the additional vRealize suite products, ops, log insight, and automation. Security, so you can control your CA from here. So you can put in your certificate authority details to generate the associated certificates, and you can also either update, remediate, or rotate your various passwords within the environment and that does include VxRail Manager. That was a recent addition. So that gives you a full list of all the components where you can update, rotate, and so forth your associated passwords. Backup, so you can select, you can register. It's by default, it leverages the SDDC Manager to back up the configuration details for SDDC Manager and NSX Manager, but you can register an external SFTP and schedule your backups for both SDDC Manager and NSX Manager. Yeah, so that's a quick overview of the SDDC Manager console. I'll hand back to you, Faisal. Yeah, stop sharing. Faisal, you might be on mute.
Oh my God, I just said a whole paragraph and I was on mute. So yeah, I think, yeah, just go. Oh, great, thanks, man. So, right, yeah. Let's go back to the, thanks for that. That was really, really good, actually. Thank you. Let's go back to the slides then. Right, I'm going to share again. Okay, so hopefully you can now see VCF VxRail system and architecture overview. So a lot of these, I actually put quite a lot of slides in there. I don't intend on going through all of them, and this is some of these things we can sort of focus on in sessions after this as well. Some of these are actually quite good because we've mentioned some of these points. Well, we've been mentioning these points as we've been going through. So housekeeping, or we could even say, we call them guardrails as well. Things, some things you can't do, or you have to watch out for. So architecturally, VCF 4.2, it's for new deployments and upgrades. So you can't, for example, take an existing VxRail system that's in production and just deploy VCF on that. I mean, technically, there's nothing stopping you, but it's just too many. It's too dangerous, basically. There's just too many aspects and changes that take place. So we're only doing this for greenfield deployments. So you'd have a brand new VxRail deployment, and then you deploy a new cloud builder on top of that. There's a point here about an upgrade path from VCF 4 from 3. I mean, we can talk about this more later on. So we have customers still on VCF 3.x. And at the moment, we're working with VMware on an upgrade method, an in-place upgrade. That's still in the works. At the moment, we're looking at ways of doing upgrades from an existing system to a new build. So, for example, you might use something like HCX to migrate to your workloads. So that's where we are at the moment in that, and that's something that's still in the works, and we can talk about that in later sessions in much more detail as more information, as we're testing that as well at the moment, and we learn more about that as well. Consolidate embedded PSC, we mentioned that early on with vSphere 7 on VCF 4.x, so they're not separate VMs. And consolidated architecture supported. That's an interesting one. So consolidated is basically where you want to run everything within your management cluster. And originally we didn't support that, but we do now. And it's limited in terms of, I mean, realistically, it's limited, has limitations in where you'd really want to run that anyway, in terms of resource. And so that's one of the reasons we didn't support it. I suppose the danger of a customer under-speccing what they really need and trying to put things they shouldn't put into a management cluster. on those types of particular nodes. But it is supported, and then we support it for particular types of environments. And vRealize Suite is deployed by vRealize Lifecycle Management. So we mentioned that earlier on. So if you do want to deploy the vRealize Suite, that's not deployed by the SDDC manager, you would deploy the VRS LCM. You would need that AVN deployment we spoke about later on, that involves building the edge clusters, NSX edge clusters. One difference, and I mean, this could be like a debate on another call as well, or a discussion, to vRealize or not to vRealize, with VCF. I know we have a lot of debates about this. One thing that is good is, I think VCF 4.1, what happen is you would deploy vRealize Lifecycle Manager, and then you would deploy your environment like work, I think it's called Identity Manager back then, or for VCF 4.01. And then you would deploy all the packages and applications, your vRealize automation and so on, through that environment you built within your Identity Manager, and that could get complicated. Whereas now, all of those upgrades are pushed from the SDDC manager into the vRealize Lifecycle Manager, even though you're actually lifecycle managing through the vRealize Lifecycle Manager. So there is a link or a hook between the two, of how you actually pull the updates down, and so that aspect is nice. And like I said, we can have a lot of debates about vRealize, which would be an interesting topic maybe for later on. NSXT only, so we mentioned that originally it was a mixture of originally it was NSXV, then a mixture of NSXV and T. This is now NSXT only. In terms of hardware, VxRail only, another important point. So we can't add into the VCF instance we've just built. We can't add in vSAN ready nodes. We'd have to have a separate instance. Physical NICs, we need 2 minimum per node. And so I mentioned consolidated architecture, which is a management cluster only. And then we would need 4 nodes minimum in there. And then we also have a standard architecture. So that's where you'd have a management cluster, and then you'd have your workloads. So for that, we'd need a minimum of 7 nodes. We'd have 4 in the management cluster and a minimum of 3 within that VI workload. 4 is best practice, you can do 3. Consolidated architecture requires 4 node VxRail minimum. Other solutions, VCF supports but does not automate the deployment of Horizon. So that'd be something you do separately. I mean, they used to originally, back in 3 dot something, you deploy, your VDI environment through SDDC, and then that was removed later on. So that is something you would do separately. You deploy once you've got the whole foundation and infrastructure up and running. PKS no longer deployed by SDDC Manager. Again, that was back in 3x something. That was removed. What we can do is we can create vSphere. We can create Kubernetes-enabled clusters. So there is a button within the SDDC Manager. And again, that's something we could do in a later session, show you how that's done. It actually passes over to vSphere, and then the Kubernetes clusters really are built through that. But there is automation in terms of the construct of NSXT that does take place. So there are a whole bunch of prerequisites that you need to have before you hit that button for the Kubernetes deployment within the SDDC Manager before that passover to vSphere then happens. And that is supported on standard architecture, and also supported in consolidated architecture as well. It wasn't initially, so that's good. Automated full stack LCM of vSphere with Kubernetes enabled clusters. Kubernetes itself is not LCM'd as part of the workload LCM. That's something you do separately. And so again, we've mentioned some of these points here: supported architectures, and also, I mean, these are probably topics we'll go through later on in terms of multi-AZ, multi-region, and DR, and what we can and can't do, and some design architectures. And I did actually put in a number of slides here, which I'm not going to go through all today, but to give you just some ideas on the constructs and the architectures that are possible. So for example, where we've got a VCF management domain, and we've added a VI workload domain here, and then we can see what's contained within the management workload. So we've created a VxRail VI workload in SDDC Manager, and we have dedicated vCenter server created by enhanced link mode. I mentioned earlier on that when we're creating a new workload domain, you would use SDDC Manager to deploy that vCenter, and then you would attach that VxRail cluster to that external vCenter. So David also showed you that button within the UI. So the VxRail cluster is imported into SDDC Manager. And then you could also, within that new cluster, you could deploy your edges after using the SDDC Manager. So there is a workflow to deploy edge clusters within that workload domain through the SDDC Manager. Here we've got a single site, one VI workload with one cluster. So we can see the management workload and VI workload, we've got our vCenter servers there for in the management cluster for both those workloads. And then we have the NSXT manager instances, both located within the management clusters. And we don't have to, or we can do that, or we can have separate NSXT instances as well. And we're basically using shared edge devices here. And there's a VxRail manager within each VxRail cluster here. Here we've got a single site, one VI workload with two clusters. Again, a single instance of NSXT for the VI workload domains, and a shared VI workload vCenter and NSXT cluster. Each cluster hosts its own VxRail manager. Okay, and like I said, I've got quite a few slides here, so we can actually dedicate an entire session to these architectures. Just wanted to really give you an idea of, what is possible, and there are so many options available now. So I've got a whole bunch of architectures here, including VCF remote clusters also, which are possible now. Latency is extremely important. So in terms of the round trip for you to be able to set up a remote cluster. Consolidated, we mentioned earlier on, so there is only the management cluster, single workload for VCF management, and your tenant workloads, 4 node minimum, recommended 8 minimum, can scale up to 64 hosts, so that's just based on the vSphere maximums. And then you wouldn't create additional workloads. And you can expand to a standard architecture. The tricky part, I suppose, is depending how much of your NSX construct was built inside there. And then if that needs to be migrated across, if you're then going to go from a consolidated to a standard architecture, and that's where it gets complicated. Otherwise, really what you're doing is on a consolidated, there's no magic button in VCF between consolidated and standard architecture. You're basically just creating a management cluster, and then you're putting everything inside there. It's the NSX piece that's really the important part, and that'll really affect on how complex it is for you to go to standard architecture then, and also depending, how much you've actually put into that management cluster, how you then migrate those across to the other workloads if you then decide to go to a standard architecture. And as I mentioned, vSphere with Kubernetes is supported on consolidated architecture, and there's a blog on that as well. And if you guys read also, Cormac Hogan does a nice blog as well. But, he's got a sort of almost step-by-step of how he did that originally. We didn't initially support that, but we do now. No support on consolidated architecture for Horizon. So that is important. You would need a standard architecture if you're going to deploy VDI. Multi-AZ single stretch VI workload. So stretch clusters, again, that's a topic we can really talk about in separate sessions. Again, latencies are extremely important here. And in terms of where the witness sits. So let me just whiz through these. So I've also put slides here, but again, this is a topic in itself. But again, this is more for your knowledge, and then we can, if you guys want to, we'll get some feedback for you guys. If you want to focus on these topics, we can do that next time. But just in terms of the NSXT constructs, and we've talked about some of these already. So the NSXT managers that are deployed in the workload by Cloud Builder, which sat in our management cluster, and then overlay and VLAN transport zone was created by the Cloud Builder. The VxRail VDS uses backing for the NSXT connectivity. So an NVDS is no longer used. Remember I mentioned earlier on, the construct earlier on, for example, with 3X, where we had a mixture of NSXV, NSXT, and we decided we wanted to create NSXT in there as well, then we had a separate NVDS that was then built. And we had to have dedicated unused NICs for that NVDS. So that's not the case anymore. And then we saw the application virtual networks, the AVNs that were deployed. So because, for example, I wanted to deploy vRealize, and that requires an AVN setup as an example. And that also includes your load balancing as well, which are deployed on the edges as part of those automations and those logical segments that are built. So 2 NSXT edges nodes were deployed. Their sizing was, it says there, medium. We had an edge uplink transport zone created with AVN, edge VMs deployed and configured, and then NSX load balancers for all the vRealize components were also deployed by the SDDC manager. And then when I deployed the vRealize Lifecycle Manager later on, and the constructs, the applications within that for vRealize, they were deployed in those logical segments that were built by the AVN setup. Okay, so I think we'll leave that to later discussions. Physical networking, and this we can also go on to later on. So, when we sort of look at, in my diagram earlier on, I had a VxRail single VDS with all my port groups sitting inside there. And then, we've got options available now of separating the port groups. So you could have a separate VDS, which you might just want for just NSX related traffic. You might want to set up NIC level redundancy. So we can do that as well. And you also want to look at physically which NICs are also being used for which types of traffic and which VDSs they're connected to and so on. So there are so many options. We could dedicate just a session to just talking about that. But in this example, we've got on that VxRail node, we can see on the NDC card, so we've got 4x10. And I think in this diagram, they're just using a 2x10 profile there as an example. And so we're deploying this VxRail with 2x10 gig NICs here. The NSX host overlay uses VxRail VDS uplinks 1 and 2, VMNIC 0 and 1. AVN's enabled, so the edge tap and uplink traffic uses VDS 1 and 2, VMNIC 0 and 1. And 2 and 3 are unused. And we also have the PCIe slots here as well. So we can actually separate traffic onto there as well, and spread out. And there are all kinds of designs we can create there. So again, that's something we can look at later on. Here we've got a 4x10 profile as another example. So, so most likely required for physical network separation in the VCF management workload. You can see in that example that the other two NICs are being used for vSAN and vMotion only. AVN still enabled, and that's being used on VDS1, and that's VMNIC 0 and 1, VDS 1 and 2. So we've got some VDSs here deployed as well. This is a 2x25 gig deployment here, and so on. So just to give you quick examples there, but again, that's something that's just a topic in itself, and we could look at later on. So how are we doing for questions, David? All okay so far?
Yep, all good thus far, yep.
For time. Okay, so 21. So I think what I'll do is let me talk about lifecycle management, and then we can sort of finish off from there. And I think those are then really, that takes us through all the sort of key topics we want to go through today. That I put over here. I'll leave this for you guys to have a read through. It's pretty much what we've already spoken about, the architectures that we support, what consolidated is, and standard, we have a workload domain. So the only, I think, key important point standard was, up to 15 workloads, including management domain, based on those vCenter maximums and the minimum number of nodes. And AVNs we've already spoken about as well. Okay, let's go on. So lifecycle management. So this is key. This is really a key piece. How did this work? And David showed you earlier on some of the screens. We might have a look at that again, actually in a bit more detail. So the point is this is one of the most complex, I suppose, areas, and it's the one where it can really burden an engineering team if you're doing this by hand. And it is slowly, even within vSAN ready nodes, it is becoming automated. So this is really a key tenet everyone wants to achieve: automated lifecycle management, where you just don't have to do this every single day because it's never ending. And particularly when it gets down to the hardware, and that's so at least we've kept that with this construct when we're putting VCF on top. So we're running the lifecycle management through SDDC Manager. That'll also run the lifecycle management of VxRail and update, whatever you get in a VxRail bundle, we're still running those updates. So that includes all the hardware updates as well. We're not creating a brand new, custom bundle for this environment. That would actually be a mistake, and we did that years ago, and then we realized this is actually, this is not a good way to do this. We actually maintained and kept our own depots. So there's an existing VMware depot with all the VMware related updates for VCF. So within the SDDC UI, and we'll show you again, there was a button where we can log into the VMware depot. And then we have our Dell depot, which contains our VxRail validated and tested bundles by our engineering team. So that's still there, and that's still used. And that's important in terms of the ability to really get these updates down to you as fast as possible without trying to re-engineer something completely new and then maintain that. These are existing constructs. So that's a huge benefit. So your SDDC manager, will log into two depots, the VMware depot and the Dell depot, and then pull those updates down. And then but everything is controlled through the SDDC UI. So you're not having to go into separate UIs to run all those lifecycle management bits. And there was a question earlier where what is the difference between available update, install only, and future updates? I mean, that points in the future. The LCM does maintain an order. So if this update needs that update before, then this update will be labeled as future. You can't run that until that one's been run. So it's good, it enforces an order in how bits are applied. And the different types of updates you can run, you can have patches and upgrades, which are pushed through, or you could have an installation. So the installation could be, for example, like a product you're installing, which doesn't come as part of the cloud builder. So, we want to keep the cloud builder small as well, not too big. And then you can add something like, for example, vRealize Lifecycle Manager, for example, would be an installation bundle. So we can see here in the SDDC Manager, we have the repository settings. And so you log in to the VMware depot, and you also log into the Dell depot, and that's then polling. I'm assuming this is an online environment. There is an answer if if this is a secure environment and that connection outside is impossible, then we can do this offline as well, which I'll talk about in a little while. So those we'll log into those depots, and then we set up some polling. We can go through proxies as well and set up all those bits if we need to. There's some restrictions there. And then you'll see there, the SDDC UI then shows you the bundles that are available, and it gives you all the version information as well. And so the mechanism really is, and there is a relationship through APIs really built through the SDDC Manager and VxRail Manager in terms of how much the VCF updates will update on SDDC and how much is updated through the VxRail bundle. I mean, because VxRail already on its own updates ESXi as an example. That's part of the bundle and updates all the hardware pieces as well. And if I had a VCF environment sitting on vSAN ready nodes, then those VCF updates would be responsible for updating a lot more, including the ESXi piece as well. So one of the reasons, you select that button in Cloud Builder, that this is a VCF VxRail environment, is so it knows about this relationship, particularly in terms of lifecycle management of which bundles will be responsible for which parts of that update process, and that's all negotiated through, north-south communication between the APIs. And so the majority of the VCF related updates will be things like VCF, NSX related updates, patches and security bits, and other additional parts, which, for example, the vRealize lifecycle parts, vCenter, which we'd externalized earlier on. And then if you're pulling down a VxRail bundle, that will include all the hardware pieces in there as well, as it normally does. So that would also then update, update BIOS, for example, could include NICs, firmware, iDRACs, and so on. So between the two, really automate the lifecycle management of the entire stack right down to the hardware. And that hardware piece is the killer. That's from experience. And I know you guys all know as well. Because I've seen, we want to concentrate, or what teams want to do is really concentrate more on things like creating blueprints within vRealize automation, as an example, create the automations for their customers, not constantly updating drivers is soul destroying, So before I go into a rant, that's how vRealize Lifecycle Manager works. And so the actual model is, it doesn't automatically push down and deploy. And it tells you it's there. And then you pull down, you hit a button, you pull down the bundles. And then you decide when you want to deploy those bundles. I mean, you can schedule that within a scheduler in there as well. But you'll decide when you want to deploy those bundles, and it will maintain an order. So you need this one before you apply this one, and so on. SDDC Manager software bundle download and update schema. So I think pretty much I've already said everything on here. I mean, you can schedule the updates, and you're deciding when you want to apply those updates. It's not pushing them automatically and onto the system, but it will notify you there are new updates available within the SDDC UI. All lifecycle manager operations must be driven through the SDDC Manager. Okay, that's really the point I wanted to highlight here. VCF offline update option is also available. So there are some other additional rules of, in a stretch cluster. Again, we can talk about that in another session. So you have a witness within a stretch cluster environment that is not updated through the Lifecycle Manager. This is the authentication process flow. So, you'll log in through the UI to the Dell depot and also log into the VMware depot as well. And then there's a periodic connectivity check and then a poll. And then you'll see what's available within the depots, within the UIs. And then you'll decide when you want to download that bundle into the SDDC manager, and then you'd run the update through the SDDC manager. And a manifest is also used, and that manifest for VCF comes down from the VMware depot, and that contains all the information related to the versions, basically of builder materials. So that really then, you know, tells the update process, these are the updates that are required for that particular version of VCF. So we can see here the VCF customer queries the release versions, his domains are running, performs regular skip level upgrades. Okay, skip level upgrades is actually another topic I can talk about. But that manifest, like I said, really contains all the information about the rules, about the releases, the updates, and what relates to, you know, that particular update. And that's on the depot. This is the offline. Well, so let's talk a little bit about offline. Actually, if you give me, how are we doing for time? 11:30. Just give me a second. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. But this is, we have a separate tool we use for offline. And I'm just going to see if I can. Let me just quickly have a look. I did an animation earlier on, but if I can't get it here, then I'll send it to you guys and you can have a look through there. Let's see if I can find the right ones. If you just give me a minute. Okay, I think I've got it. I'm just going to try running this and just have a quick check. Otherwise, I'll just talk through it.
Welcome back.
Yeah, I'm not to worry. I'm going to be able to. Yeah. 2, part 3. Sorry, guys. I think I found it. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. So, right. Let me just show you this. I'm just going to share my screen, and I can send you. This, if you want to see this animation or this sort of demo I've set up here, I'm just sharing my screen here. And yeah, so what I did here, this is actually about skip level demos, and I'll talk about that probably next. I can do a dedicated session on skip level upgrades if you guys want. What I wanted to talk about is this. Hopefully you can see that screen, David. I've got VCF, just a dark side connectivity, which is the interesting piece. But in this, you know, in this scenario here, so what we're talking about here, let me just run this and I'll talk through this then, is, you know, you've got your VCF VxRail system and it's a dark site. And so you can't be you know, you have no connection to the depots. You have to walk to another machine or another place, you know, and then download the updates separately. So we have a tool for that, which is an LCM bundle transfer tool. And then you'd have to walk to another location to actually upload those into the SDDC manager. So this tool is called the VCF offline bundle transfer tool. And, you know, it's command line based. And then I'd log in, I'd go to some station or wherever, you know, as long as I can log in online. And then I'd run that tool and I'd get a list of all the bundles and I'd download them manually. And I could download the VxRail bundles as well offline. Okay, so you can see those bundles being downloaded. And those bundles have numbers and IDs, and I can find out, you which ones I need for that update. I then when SCP them or SCP them across onto the SDDC manager. And then I would then register those bundles in the SDDC manager. So we've got a whole solve document, and so VMware, online about how to register those manually pull down updates into the SDDC manager. And you need to do that because otherwise SDDC manager won't know about those. So once they're registered, then you would just go back into the lifecycle, the SDDC UI screen, and you would just run the update as you did before. The big difference here is you're not connected to the depots. So you've run this separate tool to download those bundles, transfer those across to the SDDC manager, and then register those. And then from there on, it's just a normal lifecycle management operation. So that's the big difference with an offline LCM. And it's the same for the VCF bundles and for the VxRail bundles as well. I think that's mainly what I wanted to show you there. We have got a separate tool, which is called the skip level tool. And I think I don't have much time to go through this, but I can do a dedicated session on that if you guys need, if you've already heard of it. But the skip level tool was designed to skip versions. So if you're basically at this version here, and you've got 4 versions in between this target version, then what you can do, we can run, and this is on VMware side as well, we can run the skip level tool, which is a VCF tool. And the skip level tool, which is supported on a VCF VxRail environment, lets you then skip versions. It actually upgrades the SDDC manager to a target version, the latest, but it means then that when we upgrade the NSX and the other components, a skip takes place there to that latest version. And that's actually been very helpful within, well, actually, like, so that if you guys are interested, we can do a dedicated topic just on skip level upgrades and how that works. And I can also send you, I've got animations on this as well, which I've got. So we've put a list of resources and blogs. David's got some blogs as well, where we talk about things like this. So on the life cycle management, I think we've gone through the UIs. David already showed that to you. And then we've gone through the mechanism of how lifecycle management works and what it aims to achieve. And I've also spoken about offline upgrades and how you would do that. I didn't go through skip level upgrades because I don't think there's enough time, and it's probably better to have a separate session on that. But David, how are we looking on questions on that so far? I was just wondering, do you guys have any questions on lifecycle management so far?
It's a great job, Faisal. So yeah, you covered a lot. You've covered a ton of information there. It might be a good time now to, if anyone has some verbal questions, maybe if they want to come off mute.
I'll just stop sharing my screen. I need to find the button. There it is. Oh, it's gone. Okay, so yeah, so I think we've got a bunch of questions inside the chat, and David's answered all those so far. So brilliant, thanks for that. So I think that's probably a good place to stop on. Let me just summarize on what we've gone through so far, and then I just want to show you a list of resources as well. So we started off by going through an introduction. How we build. Well, what is VCF and how we build a VCF, and we start off with a VxRail cluster to the diagram. If you guys like the diagram, I've been practicing, but I looked on Amazon. I think you can get some pens that look like mice, but they work like pens, so it might be easier to whiteboard. I just really miss whiteboarding, so I've been trying this. So we drew a diagram about, the construct, what you start with on VxRail, and then what VCF adds on top of that. And we also looked at an AVN deployment as well. So we introduced some terms to you guys. And then we had a look at the architectures and just some of the rules behind, the architectures, what you can and can't do. And we went through, David went through the UI on SDDC Manager. We had a look at the demo center and we ran through a deployment as well. So you saw how, on a VxRail cluster, we can then deploy Cloud Builder and then create that VCF environment and also build AVN on top of that and with our edge cluster deployment. And we had a look at a couple of ideas on architecture and constructs. And that is like a topic in itself. So we can look at that in more detail. And then we also looked at lifecycle management, which is really a tenet of this product, lifecycle management and how that works also, including offline lifecycle management. Let me show you guys some resources because I think it's a lot of information we've been through today. Hopefully we varied it as well for you guys. I didn't want to just stick to slides. Tried a few things here. Let me just show you a couple of resources and we'll send you these slide decks, the slide deck, just for your reference with all, because there are more slides in here which we put in for your reference as well. I'll just share my screen again. I wish Zoom would just put that share button just in one place. That's maybe because I've got 3 screens. Oh yeah, there it is. So if I, oh, wait a minute. Oh, lost my slide deck. Where is it? Okay, here we go. Yeah, got it. Okay, here we go. So hopefully you should see the PowerPoints again. I just wanted to go through these resources. All these links are live. So, you had a look at the solid procedures, and I'm sure most of you have already seen, but if you haven't, I mean, for VCF also and for VxRail combined, then we have solid procedures, which then, you would have access to as partners when you're deploying or building these environments. We've got architecture guides. So we have like a page, which is VxRail is everything. And on there, we have also VCF related information as well. And their architecture documents, there's some good, the facts are really good because they just go through questions and answers that you'll have. So they're useful. And a lot of those also contain links to other resources. So I took some of the links for those documents and put them into here. But have a look at the actual facts. The support matrix, so which VCF version on which version of VxRail. And then we have some decks as well, technical decks, sizing tools, VMware configuration maximums. This is a nice tech fact actually, which contains a lot of the links I was using. And then you had a look at the demo center. So I just showed you the VCF bring up there, but there was a whole bunch of stuff inside there as well. If you want to deploy a workload domain or create a, deploy a, I think the Kubernetes was inside there as well. If you want to see that and you can't access a live system, actually we'll save time, it's much better here. And so these are also some useful blogs and vids. David's got a really good blog where he goes through a lot of the bring up and a lot of issues that I hit. Cliff, Ed, Jeremy. So these guys are all in our team. I've got some demos set up on EduTube for the skip level tool if you guys are interested in that. And like I said, we can do a dedicated session on that if you guys want. Our team, the GEOS team, we have a blog set up on there with links to the other blogs and demos on side there. And there's also the VxRail technical marketing link as well. And we're always happy to help you guys. And if you guys get any questions, definitely get in touch with us. It's actually really nice, with lockdown to actually be able to speak to all of you, to be honest. So really thanks for there's a big number here. So thanks for everyone coming here. David, do you want to add anything? Just before we sort of summarize.
No, as the super job, Faisal. Really good. A lot of content, a lot of information shared out. So I suppose before handing back to Stephen, or Stephen, if you want to conclude, or perhaps if anyone has any questions, if they want to verbally ask a question, they can take themselves off mute now.
No questions.
Great. Okay. Well, so
Good.
no questions. Okay. I mean, I mean, if you guys have a think, so I think the plan is we're going to run these every quarter. Have a think about what you'd like to see next, and we can sort of start to, because we've set up a foundation now, and if everyone's at the same level, we can start focusing on particular topics, next time. But yeah, Steve, if you maybe want to finish up.
That's exactly right. I think that this was a foundational session for this. I think you covered a lot of information. The web links, those are tremendously valuable for all of our partners. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. So we'll make available the slide decks and web links to you, either from a shared location or sending. Hopefully not having to send them out to all of you, but we will if we have to send it all to you. In that follow-up email to you, session to you, where we tell you where to find the slides and the links. I'll also probably ask you, what are some of the other ideas that you'd like to see included in the next session? I think, Faisal, you came up with a bunch of things, a deep dive session elements you thought would be good. So we'll give them an opportunity to come back to us with some ideas of their own, and then I want to thank everybody for your attention. This is a tremendous turnout, much like a lot more than I thought would show. So thank you very much for your good questions on the chat, and we'll let you know when the next one is in Q3, and I look forward to seeing you all there. All right. Any questions or recommendations, also feel free to come back to me directly, or Faisal or David or Jesper. You can come back to any one of us with any suggestions you have. So with that, thank you very much. I think that we will close the session. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks very much, guys. It's great talking.
Thank you, Faisal. Thank you, David. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. Hope to see you guys
Take care.
again.
Okay, take care. Bye. Bye.